Well, our next discussion is going to be on Black Lives Matter, racial justice, and catalyzing necessary systems change. The pandemic has highlighted many long-standing social and racial inequities, from public health to climate change, and systematic bias existing all over the world. To confront these inequities and how they affect our societies and economies, we welcome Reverend Leah Daughtry to moderate this session. Reverend Daughtry is a recognized organizer and activist, political strategist, author, and multifaceted leader in the United States. She's also a member of the Women's Forum editorial board. Please welcome Reverend Leah Daughtry. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Okay, I'm from the Talkback Church. Good afternoon. Black Lives Matter. It is at once a declaration and an affirmation. It is a plea and a demand. It is a recognition and a mantra. Earlier in the pandemic, our attention was galvanized after the killing of George Floyd, captured for the world to see by one brave girl and her cell phone camera. All across the world, the global community was transfixed. We were horrified. And we were mobilized. The question for us is, was that a moment or was that a movement? Where does the global community stand today? What do we do in the aftermath of what we did post-George Floyd? Are we transformative or are we transactional? So today, we're going to dive into some of those issues and what I hope will be a very lively conversation. And I want you to welcome with me my panel, Margaret Anadu, partner and global head of sustainability and impact at Goldman Sachs. LaTosha Brown, the founder of Black Voters Matter. And through the wonders of technology, Kedra Newsom Reeves, managing director and partner of Boston Consulting Group. So we're going to start off, LaTosha, with you. And I want to ask you to offer us your reflections on where we are in this moment, now post the uprising of the George Floyd killing. What is the opportunity that you see for collective benefit for all women?
Well, the first thing I did right was the day I started to fight. Keep your eyes on the prize and hold on, hold on. You know, I always start, and I want to thank you. I like to thank you. I'd like to start in the spirit of what this is really about. You know, and when we're talking about in this moment, where we are in this moment, I think that we're in a defining moment, not in just our nation's history, but in the world's history. And I think we have to really understand what opportunity. You know, we have to really have an analysis to recognize that the same thing that anchors racism and white supremacy is the same thing that anchors sexism. It is the same thing that anchors homophobia, right? And so we are intricately connected in our work. And so I believe in this moment, while we are taking a collective kind of breath in to really re-examining where we are, it is also an opportunity for women to assert ourselves and to actually come up with a different vision for the world so that we can actually create the kind of world that is inclusive and fair and just.
Excellent. Thank you, LaTosha. You know, it always occurs to me that in these struggles for equality and equity, the most disenfranchised people tend to war against each other as though equality was a limited resource. And we fail to recognize that more equality for me doesn't mean less equality for you. It's not pie. There's enough for everybody. And so, Kedra, I want to ask you to lean into the idea of equity and inclusion. First, welcome on the big screen. And your holistic approach to progress. What's nice to do versus what's necessary to do, and how you see equity and inclusion as an integrated principle as we move forward in the world.
Thanks, Leah. I mean, I think LaTosha hit on it, in her comment at the beginning here that, we have to admit that we were built, our societies, our economies were built on an exclusionary system for Black people in America, for minorities around the world, for women, for LGBTQ community. And when you take a look at that and you really think about that, and I think that's really what George Floyd's murder kind of catalyzed and helped everyone come to some realization around, to really change that reality that's been built up over hundreds of years, it requires a really holistic approach. And one of the things that we've been thinking about a lot as a firm and as a team is how do we articulate that? How do we think about that? And I think, in the corporate space, in the public sector, and many other areas, people talk a lot about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we immediately go to our teams and our culture. Do we have a diverse workforce? Do we have a diverse team? Are people being supported, promoted, et cetera? And that is incredibly important. I think people then often think about philanthropy and community. How can I volunteer in my community? Where do I give? How can I maybe advocate for policies that are inclusive? I think the thing that we have to really push on is because we were so much built on exclusionary systems, we have to think about our systems, about our business strategies, about our processes, about who's sitting at the table to make those decisions, about the products and services that we provide. This concept of exclusion, this concept is really built into so many areas of our lives. And I think we really have to analyze that very deeply. And really think about what does a holistic approach to that look like? What does systemic change really look like?
Thank you, Kedra. Now, Margaret, you're doing something very innovative at Goldman Sachs to address, and we've talked often about the structural problem that Kedra just referenced and how we address that. And so Goldman's taken a rather innovative approach with a program called 1 Million Black Women, which is a $10 billion investment, a direct capital investment, and $100 million of philanthropic investment in the life cycle of Black women to address these disparities. Tell us more about that, how Goldman came to that, and what do you hope to achieve through this program?
Absolutely. I wish I could preach and I wish I could sing, but I can do neither of those things, so I'll just talk. And actually, it's so exciting to be here, and I appreciate the question. And it's actually great to talk really after the comments that Kedra made, because it touches on two really important things. One, taking a holistic approach. So this $10 billion commitment that we've made to narrow opportunity gaps for
that's $10 billion with a B.
With a B. With a B. Mm-hmm. Over the next decade, doesn't focus on any one aspect of the problem, right? There's access to capital, there's healthcare, there's housing, there's education. There are all of these aspects of our society in the US that hold Black women back, and where we can very quantitatively and with research really see where these disadvantages are and the impacts of them. And so we knew that we needed to cut across all of those issues and be comprehensive, because if we can tackle, exclusion in housing, right, that's not going to matter if we're still not where we need to be on workforce and wages or educational attainment. So one thing that's really exciting about it for me is this holistic approach we're taking. The second piece, I'd say, is about this is our core business, right? So for Goldman Sachs to want its kind of contribution in this space to be around allocating capital makes all the sense in the world, right? We're a 150-year-old institution that at its core, we allocate capital, we put resources, dollars, strategy behind entrepreneurs so that they can innovate, so they can move our society forward. And so to do that in two key ways through this initiative: one, very literally making sure that we're getting capital behind Black female entrepreneurs who not only understand the challenges in their communities, but of course the solutions. And then two, going beyond that, putting capital behind the much broader infrastructure that needs to support Black women, that needs to center Black women in their products and services. And again, that's across the board. So we're just getting started. It's very purposefully a big dollar in 10 years because we know this is hard work, and we're not going to dismantle any of these issues that have been building for decades and generations in a moment, in a second, in one initiative. And so this is really about starting to do that hard work in this comprehensive way.
Fabulous. All of you have touched on the idea of investment in communities, in women, in order to change culture, in order to move the needle. And we saw a lot of commitment post the George Floyd era, the killing. We saw a lot of companies pledge millions and millions and millions of dollars. I want to ask you to weigh in a very blunt way. Was that out of a notion of solidarity, out of guilt, out of conviction? Why do you think they did that? And is it sustainable?
You know, I would say there are stages to this, right? I think, you know, you touched on that moment with George Floyd, which importantly, of course, didn't happen in isolation, right? We were all at home, masks on, terrified, you know, sitting on our couches in a very just, you know, vulnerable and confused place around the state of the world broadly. So even leading up to that moment, we were certainly watching the disproportionate impact both on an economic basis, on a healthcare basis of just COVID. So first, just, you know, it was quite the moment to sort of watch that, because as we all know in our community, there are thousands of George Floyds, right? This wasn't the first time in any way. And so I think part of the pledges, that was just the shock moment. I've got to do something, right? And so, you know, a colleague of mine said, you know, part of those first moments were the price of admission. You saw a lot of philanthropy. You saw dollars going behind some of the largest civil rights institutions in the US, and that's all great. That makes sense, but that's the first step. Because I think at the end of the day, for this to be sustainable, you have to look at the practices that are your core business. So supporting organizations who've been doing the work well for decades, that's part of it. But especially for for-profit institutions, philanthropy is always going to be, it's corporate engagement, it's part of the work, it's part of citizenship, but it's not the core business. So I think the pledges we saw, and you've seen those even change since. Like the pledges that I've seen more recently seem more core to business products and services than what we saw, call it, you know, June, July of 2020. So we're on a journey.
You know, I think building on what you shared, there are a couple of things. The first thing that comes to mind for me is that we have to really be honest about, you know, what is going to require. You cannot create change without creating change. And so as an institution, you cannot maintain being the same and saying, I want change outside of myself without an acknowledgement that there's going to require structural change within your institution. And so I think that what we see is there's this tendency to deal with a social justice work as if it's a auxiliary, as if it's some charitable, right? And there's not a fundamental understanding that literally our greatest resource are human beings. For any company, it is your talent, it's the human beings. If we're not investing, right, in our greatest, this is our unlimited resource, then what are we doing? And so in order to be able to tap into the brilliance of communities of color, to be able to tap into the brilliance of women who have been underrepresented and marginalized in these spaces, it's going to require us to actually be the source of change. That we're going to have to use what's in our context with our institutions to create that change. And so I think that there's a number of things. I think that one, there was a just as you said, I think that there was a knee-jerk reaction that was very transactional. And the challenge with being transactional is that it's episodic, it's temporary, and it does not create sustainable change, right? It feels good in the moment, right? It lifts you up in the moment, but it doesn't really create change. But when you're being transformative, we all know that there's an arc of change. Like it doesn't take a rocket science. Even in our own institutions, our own businesses, we know that it takes, and there's a space that we have to lean into the discomfort. And so part of what I also recognize that I think part of the challenge is we like to feel good, right, but not the discomfort. And I remember I always reference my grandmother who used to say, baby, your test of the relationship is not when everything is going great. It is when things are challenging. That's when the true test of the relationship, the strength of the relationship. And so I think we also have to see that within the context of corporate America, that are you willing to lean into this moment and this opportunity to create change, not something that is external to yourselves, but that you're facilitating also as an institution.
So Kedra, stay right there. How do we create the change in our institutions? Because the institutions are not the brick and mortar, right? It's the people that come inside our buildings every day, that advance our businesses, who also go back to their communities where they are navigating these kinds of strives and woes. So stay right there. What do we do to create change inside our institutions?
Thanks, Leah. I mean, I think what you just said is really important. Systems are not organic. They don't build up by themselves. They are led by people. They are people making decisions. There are tables and teams coming together to work through a question or a challenge. And so we have to really think about who is sitting at that table. How do we have more Leahs and LaToshas and Margarets and others, and many of the women that are in this event and speaking on this stage today? How do we get those individuals at the table? Because then it becomes a different conversation. I think what we also saw in those pledges, I think, yes, I think it was reaction. I think it was about solidarity. I think for many leaders, it was about legacy. What will I look like in this moment? How do I want to lead this company in this historical time that we're in? So I think that drove a lot of it too. But I think one of the big challenges is I don't think folks fully understood how hard it would be. And I think Margaret said this very well around their commitment and the work that she's doing. You know, this is difficult work. These are companies, these are organizations that have existed for decades, some for over 100 years or hundreds of years, depending on the organization we're talking about. So they have their own culture, their own practices, their own policies. And really, if we talk about being inclusive, that requires a transformation of how you do business. And that is not a trivial effort. That is not writing a check for a nonprofit. That is not simply promoting a few leaders into the right positions. That is really deeply looking at your practices, your processes, your products, and saying, what do we need to change about what we do today to be more inclusive? And that is real deep work. I think the other thing that's really critical here, and it's a point that I think LaTosha and Leah, I think you made earlier around, who are we engaging in this work outside of ourselves? What partners are we giving to? So yes, we gave to many civil rights organizations in June, July of 2020. But who should our partners be going forward? Who has been doing this work for decades that we should be engaging, that actually really do understand the answers to these questions that we're trying to solve, and how do we engage them as we think about our business practice? So I think a big part of this is that it is deeply transformative for an organization to think differently about being inclusive and across the various levers and areas that they are involved in. And so I think that to me is what we're seeing now is the real challenge. You might have had a few organizations you could give to over the last, the first 6 months, and then you realized, actually, I don't know what to do next, or the change I need to make is deeper. And I think what we're seeing, to Margaret's point now, are pledges and commitments that are far more structured, far more intentional, and are driving more impact than where we were, in the early days of this movement, if you will.
Excellent, thank you. So I want to stick there where Kedra left us off and talk about the tension of the investments and how we determine who and where we're going to invest. Who are the decision makers? How do we really honor the wisdom of the community? And I recognize that we've all got to honor our bottom lines and make sure we're making wise investments. So how do we do that And we know that the civil rights groups and the long-standing, great. Are there others? How do you bring others into, how do you create pathways for people who've been left out of such a process, for the women who are inside your companies and who are on the ground? What's that, how do you hold that tension around what to invest in and how to invest?
You know, I think it's not surprising that I'm going to riff off something Kedra said. We've spent a lot of time talking about these issues, but I think part of it goes to not just where you've given money, what the pledges look like, what the intentions look like, but what those relationships look like. So it's one thing to say, you know, here's $20 million for this incredible civil rights organization to go continue to do the great work that they've been doing. And you go do that, and that's going to be awesome, and I'm going to sit here and continue to make plates or develop movies or whatever the core business is. It's a very different thing to say, I want to partner with you, I want to hear you, and I want to engage with you on what you think about what I'm doing in my business, in my products and my services. That actual listening and letting someone in, to your point about discomfort, to say, you know what, you're never going to reach this Black community or these Black entrepreneurs if you continue to do it that way. And so you need to change and you need to tweak. And that is hard, right? Especially when, to your point about bottom line and the way that these structures and systems and companies have been built, you can be deeply profitable, maybe not paying as much attention to these issues, these communities and demographics as you should. So I think the first thing that is so crucial, and this has been a significant part of our work, both with 1 million Black women, but on all of our work investing in and for Black communities for decades, is that listening, right? We can have all the capital in the world to commit, all the investing expertise, but until we're willing to, we just did a big listening session event in Baltimore, whether it's Detroit or the Lower Ninth in New Orleans, DC, et cetera, until we're willing to say, okay, this is my intention, this is what I'd like to do, this is what I'm trying to accomplish, tell me how to do it. You tell me, person who's not a part of Goldman Sachs, who's not a Goldman Sachs employee, to invite them into your investing process, to your elimination process, what we're going to do and what we're not going to do. There are things that we might think are a great idea, and then we learn and we listen and engage, and we hear that it's not. So I think fundamentally figuring out how to alter your systems, your processes, your ways of elimination and selection to allow other voices directly into it, that's what you have to do. And I can tell you, even in the, it's 8 months or so since we've announced the specific investment ideas, philanthropic ideas, new initiatives and partnerships that I'll tell you transparently that we would not have thought of on our own. We might not have thought was a good idea a year ago, 2 years ago, before starting to have these direct engagements with both individuals and organizations. It's been hard, but it's been tremendous, absolutely tremendous.
So LaTosha, I want to ask you, because you're actually on the ground in a not-for-profit doing the work of equity inclusion. Do these investments even matter? Can they help make change? Does it affect the dial on the work that you are doing, on the things that the community needs? Does it even make business sense or community sense?
Oh, absolutely. I'm known for the work of Black Voters Matter, but my most pride vision is a network that I started, the Southern Black Girls and Women's Consortium, which is a $100 million 10-year initiative. And the irony around it, there are three things I want to raise that I think are learning lessons in this process. The first thing is that there's always an assumption. One of the biggest mistakes I think that corporate America and larger institutions make is that infrastructure does not exist, because the infrastructure does not look the same as possibly in the corporate space. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Our approach has been that every community we go, we operate with the assumption that infrastructure is already there. How do we identify where that infrastructure or that ecosystem and literally be able to support that particular ecosystem? And that has turned out to be very successful for us. The second thing is that we're actually looking at, we're coming from an abundance perspective, not a deficit perspective. We believe that there's an abundance of knowledge, of resources. There's an abundance within those communities themselves, that the resources, we see them as activators, that the problems won't just get solved because you put money at it, but that you have to use the brilliance and the talent and the treasure within those communities, as well as the visioning, and connect that with resources, and that will make a shift. You know, before I started the fund, I was really frustrated. There was a report that came out by the Southern Rural Black Women that talked about philanthropy of the $4 billion that were going into the South. Less than 1% was going to women and girls completely. And I was really frustrated around that model. And so I'd worked with philanthropy. I'd ran a organization that made up of funders, of large major funders and smaller regional funders. And for 3 years, I did every report you could name. It was like, we need to do a study. Okay, I did 5 studies. We need to do research. I had 2 research pieces put together. And at the time, I just wanted us to set up a $10 million fund. We never did it. Literally, we started the Southern Black Women's and Girls Consortium, Southern Black Girls and Women's Consortium. Within a matter of 15 months, we had raised $11 million. We had set 2 grant cycles. We had created, because what we did is we tapped into the brilliance and the infrastructure of the community that already existed. And so I think the third thing that we have to actually look at when we're talking about how do we move this work forward, that we also have to recognize that the process itself, right, that if we're talking about empowering, and that the only empowering is let me write you a check, and not really seeing people to what I call giving people grace, giving them space, and literally being able to go with the pace of how that community goes. And so when we're operating from that framework and that paradigm, what we see is we see results. We see much more sustainable results, because it's coming from an authentic place of change of those people who are anchored in those communities that will lead that change, whether initiative or program continues to stay there.
Mm-hmm. I just have to, something that you said, I literally wanted to just jump out of my seat, because this point about this deficit narrative is crucial to really attack. So one of the things that we've been very focused on in all our work, so this is beyond and before even 1 million Black women, is that if you go to, like, for example, we've had a business called the Urban Investment Group. We've deployed about $12 billion over the last couple decades, fairly exclusively in Black communities around the US. And we always say, and people still forget, and then we say it again, we are doing it because they are good investments. The fact that there has been a structural lack of investment in Black communities, in Black entrepreneurs, that's not because they're bad investments. That's not because there aren't commercial opportunities there. They're there because of structural and purposeful decades of exclusion. And in any asset class, when you find something where there's been a clear misallocation of capital, and you can finally get that capital there, the focus there, the resources there, you tend to outperform. And so one thing that I have to say, and I probably should have said it earlier, one of the reasons why we've made a $10 billion commercial investment commitment in Black women is because we think it's one of the best places we can be investing in, period, end of. We think we're gonna do incredibly well. We think these investments are gonna be incredibly commercial, and it's the right thing to do, but I'm a trained investor. I work at Goldman Sachs. It's the smart thing to do.
So Kedra, I'd like you to stay in this space and talk to us about what are some of the barriers to getting this done, to really moving the needle. And how do we dismantle those barriers? How do we work around those barriers? How do we tear down those barriers? But what are some of the challenges and barriers to really making meaningful change here?
Thanks, Leah. I think part of it's just what Margaret was getting at. There are a lot of myths about why we exclude people and founders and communities. And I think part of this is about the intentionality around trying to reassess what we believe about people that are excluded in every conversation. I think we have to be doing that. And I think that honestly is one of the biggest barriers. It is this question of what are we assuming about an excluded population? Why do we continue to exclude them? What does that mean? And when you actually assess that, I'll just give an example. We looked a lot in our work at the un- and underbanked, and people assume that people that are underbanked are very low income, uneducated, unemployed, et cetera. And we actually found people that are underbanked look much like the average citizen. They are employed. They have a salary. They and actually their status and being underbanked. We could be talking about, an NBA player that's underbanked. It is about access. It is about who was reaching out to you. It is about how you were included in systems and processes and practices and footprint, if you will, if we're talking about banks or retail. And so I think so much of this is simply about intention first. I think the second piece is a bit around what you're talking about earlier. I think we have to admit there have been market failures. I think Margaret raised a great point. People have not invested in Black communities because they weren't attractive investments. They were excluded, and so there's opportunity there to be more inclusive, to grow the economy as a whole. But it requires, again, looking at areas you didn't previously look at. And maybe the last thing I would say is I think these are real changes to business process. If we think about small business services as an example, if you don't have a sales force that is reaching out to small businesses in a diverse community, is not seeing the asset-based lens, not the deficit-based lens around that community, then you are not able to really be inclusive. And I think the other barrier is just that from an implementation perspective, it does require real investment and does require us to say, we're not going to invest here. We're going to invest a little less in this area that we were previously going down, and we're going to invest a little more over here to ensure that we are being inclusive in the work that we're doing. So I think certainly there are challenges. I actually don't think there are barriers. It is really about intentionality in your strategy and an intentionality in the effort you're taking and having the right voices at the table as well.
Can I just add?
Quickly.
I don't know. Okay. I just want to add one piece to this because I want us to look at this from a perspective of, why Black women and what does this tell us, right? When we look at Black women, let's go to the U.S., right? In America, one of the things you're supposed to do is you're supposed to go to school. You go to school, right? Black women enter college more than any other constituency group. Check. Okay, you're supposed to start a business, right? Okay. Black women actually start small businesses more than any other group in the country, constituency group per capita. Okay, and then you're supposed to vote. Black women actually turn out and vote higher than any constituency group. Then how, if we're checking the boxes, how is it that economically, in every single category, what we're seeing is Black women being at the bottom? That actually points to not a deficiency of Black women, it points to a deficiency. There are structural issues that we've got to deal with. And so if we're serious about going forward and creating the kind of world we all want to see, then we have to really recognize it's going to take us having the courage to work at the margins and to recognize that we need structural change.
Thank you. So the Women's Forum, when we leave here, we want to have a set of actions, 100 actions that our participants who are in the room gathered and those who are watching from around the world will be able to take and to do. So I'm going to ask each of you to quickly give us your one action or two that women can take from this room and take into their daily lives. So I'll start with you, LaTosha, and we'll go to Kedra, and the final one, Margaret.
I'm going to ask people to do it right now. So in your seats right now, I'm going to ask you two questions. I'm going to ask you if you can close your eyes, kind of get centered. And my question to you is, what would the world look like without racism and sexism? Two, what would the world look like if all human beings felt respected and valued? Now you can open your eyes. The reason why I asked that question is that those two questions, we never ask ourselves that. And the truth of the matter is there's nothing that has been brought into existence in the physical world that was not first envisioned, nothing. And so if we're not envisioning what that world looks like, we will not get there. And so my challenge to you is that we've got to spend more time in terms of visioning what is possible when people are able to operate in the fullness of their power, and what is possible when women are operating without being encumbered by racism and sexism and poverty and those things and sexual violence. And so I think it's really important. My action to you is to vision more, to radically reimagine a world that people can stand in the fullness of our power.
Thank you. Kedra, we go to you next.
I think I love that exercise, LaTosha, and I think there's a question on who are you listening to, who are you mentoring, and who are you being mentored by? I think we all have an opportunity as we think about that exercise that LaTosha laid out. What are we being influenced by? How are we thinking about that question? And how are we on a learning journey continuously for ourselves and diversifying those voices? I think it's important to understand that change will only happen if we all are working toward it together. If every person understands that they have a role in driving change and is using their voices and their ears to think about the role that they play in that.
Thank you, Kedra. And finally, Margaret.
I love that. I love both of those. So I would say, from a specific corporate perspective, we all make something, do something, sell something, market something, right? There's some product, there's some service. So I would say to go back, think about who that product serves. Who do you sell it to? Who do you market to? Who's part of the marketing? Who's part of the manufacturing? And most of you will probably come to the view that it's not being done in an equitable way. And then the second question would be to say, why is that? And then the third thing would be to say, what can I do to change that?
Perfect. I could talk to you all day. There's so much to unpack and so much to do. The fact of the matter is that this work of equity and inclusion is hard work. It didn't get broken in a day. It's not going to get fixed in a day. It will take all of us doing our part in order to make the change that we want for ourselves and for our children and our children's children. And so I leave you with the words of Harriet Tubman, abolitionist and suffragist. When you hear the dogs barking, keep going. When you see the white of their eyes, keep going. If you want a taste of freedom, keep going. Thank you so much.
Thank you.